Mark Carney's operating on let me get the best deal. Well, you've kept upping the ante, Prime Minister Carney, on what that best deal looks like by blowing these arbitrary, I would say, self-imposed timelines that you set out. Now you're increasing the bar on yourself, which doesn't seem all that politically smart.
Everyone is gearing up for the fall parliamentary session. Nick Nanos was quoted recently as saying the next 3 months are going to make or break Mark Carney. So when CBC assembled a panel to talk about what's coming this fall, it was very surprising to see that all of them didn't have a lot of positive things to say about the Liberals. Let's take a look.
Laura, let's start with you. What do you make of the Prime Minister and his time in office to this point?
So I think right now, up to this point, it's been the Mark Carney show, which makes perfect sense given how he became leader and how they won the election, right? I think that makes a lot of sense. But what I'm starting to watch and what I think is going to be really fascinating as we head into a more traditional parliamentary session is caucus relations. This is a new part of any job, frankly, for Prime Minister Carney. Prime Minister Carney is used to being the governor of a bank, a CEO, chair of a board. Those are big jobs where ultimately you get to make the decisions, right? You're trying to bring your department heads and whomever else along with you. This is very different, right? Now you could either look at it as you have 179 team members, if you're into sports analogies, which I'm not, or you have 179 shareholders or members of the board. That is a very different dynamic. And it's something that I don't think we're used to seeing from Prime Minister Carney. He hasn't been a member of Caucus before, so he's not necessarily used to the politics of that, and he hasn't had to lead it. And those of us who watch politics all the time know that often when you start to see the honeymoon slip, you're seeing that with caucus relations first. You're seeing some of that angst. They're going to hold you accountable because ultimately they have to answer to their constituents for decisions the Prime Minister is often making. And so I'm really watching how caucus is shaping up. I'm really trying to hear and listen to some of those smaller press conferences and what's the tone and tenor of that, especially as, you know, to your earlier point, this is supposed to be a pretty rock and roll fall for the government.
So that was a former advisor to Justin Trudeau. So that was the Liberal. Some interesting things that she said, and we talked about this on our video yesterday, where the caucus seems to already be fracturing because of what Mark Carney did in recognizing Palestine as a state. Now, you don't have to agree with that or disagree with that, but the issue there is that because he decided to get off of the fence on that, which is where most politicians would have stayed, it's a problem because now you've essentially thrown all your weight to one side, which means you have to deal with all of the people that are going to be criticizing you from the other side of that. So that's a big issue. And then when Anthony Housefather and the 31 other Liberals penned this letter and decided to release it to the public, that's a shot across the bow. That's what that is. Otherwise, that would have just been a discussion inside of caucus. So one thing that letter did is completely illustrate that there is a big gap within caucus right now in terms of what people are thinking about the whole Israel, Palestine, and Gaza and Hamas issue. Now, the other thing that she said, which aligns with some of the things that we've talked about in our analysis of Mark Carney, is that he's not a politician. He came from an environment where he's the dictator. As the CEO, as the president, whatever you want to call it, he tells people what to do. And if they don't do what he says, they get fired. Well, this is the difference in Parliament. You may be the leader of the party, but if one of your MPs doesn't do what you tell them to, you don't get to fire them. That's not how this works. So he has to be careful in actually how he deals with this. And the fact that she equates caucus to a board of directors, I think is actually very fair because the CEO ultimately answers to the board of directors. And the board of directors actually gets to fire the CEO. Now, the Liberals chose not to adopt the Reform Act, which would have allowed them to actually oust Mark Carney if they didn't like him. But, you know, That won't happen again, right? That won't happen again. That was just Justin Trudeau. So this is where they're going to have an issue. But it's interesting that she's, it's telling. The way she's saying this, being a liberal, she's actually saying that he's going to have some problems here, and he actually isn't doing a great job in managing what's going on in Caucus. And I think Caucus is going to come back, and they're going to come back with a bunch of questions from their constituents. Where's the trade deal? I thought it was elbows up. He completely bowed down to Trump. What the heck's going on? So they're going to be bringing all of these issues back to Parliament and their caucus meeting. And it's going to be a rough conversation. And even she says it's going to be a pretty crazy fall. Let's continue.
Yeah, and obviously Caucus is what took down Prime Minister Justin
Correct.
Trudeau. That was his weak spot. That's really what pushed him out. Michael, how do you think the Prime Minister has done so far to this point? What do you make of his actions over the summer?
Look, well, I wouldn't call it sunny ways necessarily, but he's, to borrow an old term, but no, he's clearly doing well. I think the polling supports that. It's early days. But he was elected on a very clear mandate to accomplish a number of different things, some of which he's made some progress towards. And you mentioned it, JP. He's removed the retail price on carbon, which was a big election promise. He stood up the major projects legislation and passed it. But he's also elected under a mandate to go after Trump and to sort out Canada's position amongst this trade war, which has very real economic impacts, of course. And ultimately, I think we're seeing very little progress, at least in terms of outcomes, really on any front. The major projects office has been announced will be stood up shortly here, which is a step in the right direction. But on things like housing, he has yet to put the right leadership into Build Canada Homes. The trade war is ongoing with rather, I think, a clumsy message, a continued use of hockey analogies to describe kind of our current position and the rationale behind those measures. So all of this to say, I'd say he's doing fine. But at some point, Canadians and industry are going to want more than just promises and more than just ambition and aspiration. They're going to want to see real outcomes. And he's already behind, I think, on that message, at least as it relates to the trade war. And then on his own internal issues, domestic ones, like these nation-building projects and this grand bargain and exercise he's having with the provinces, there's still nothing to report on that. I know Minister Hodgson has said, wait and see what the fall brings. Fine, we can take him at his word. But if they go through this fall session without some clear wins, some early wins out of this government, I think the Prime Minister's risking the wheels falling off in terms of his popularity, which he's so far been enjoying.
So I don't understand that answer. I don't understand how he starts by saying he's doing well, and the polls reflect that. I don't understand that. Because in the latter half of his answer, he says, well, he hasn't done this, and the tariff war has been garbage, and they haven't delivered on this, and they haven't appointed a CEO on that, and he's going to have problems with this, and he's going to have problems with that. So I don't understand that answer at all. This is a former staffer to Stephen Harper. This is Mike Soderberg. So I don't get it. And I don't understand how he can say that, well, he cut the carbon tax, which was an election promise. It was an election, I would say, unavoidability, because the Conservatives made them do it. That's what that is. So I don't know if these guys are told that you have to come on these panels and be balanced, otherwise you're not allowed to come on. I'm starting to wonder if that's the case when it comes to the Conservative commentators. I don't know. But that whole answer, it was, oh, he's doing well, but except for everything that he's done, which is garbage. He's literally accomplished nothing. And he even said there was a bunch of things where it's not even going anywhere. So how can you say he's doing well based on that? Like the polls that were really reported were basically as a result of right after the election. So, but now we're actually seeing the polls starting to shift. As we said a couple days ago, but Abbott is actually showing the Conservatives in the lead. And this is without Pierre Poilievre in the House. This is without the Conservatives really hitting the Liberals over the head. So it's really going to be interesting to see what happens. But sorry, Mike, I don't understand the take.
Yeah, Zane, let's zero in on that Canada-U.S. trade relationship, because the Prime Minister, as we all know, was really elected on that elbows up mantra. And since then, we've seen him drop the digital services tax. We've seen him drop the retaliatory tariffs, at least some of them. And he has not matched the U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum. He is not going that extra 25% that Trump put on us. So he's trying to show some goodwill to the Americans. But to this point, he hasn't really got that much for it. How do you think he's handling that file that was really front and center back in the election?
Not particularly well as it relates to two things: outcomes, as Michael mentioned, and communicating with us around what progress has been made over the summer. Listen, he not only got elected on that elbows up mantra, he got elected on that mantra coupled with speed, with meeting deadlines that were aggressive, that were bold, that were eye-popping, that would say, whoa, Mark Carney, government doesn't work that fast. Well, guess what? We're now at the end of August, and Mark Carney has realized government doesn't work that fast. He's blown a couple of deadlines, and when you blow deadlines, people will generally excuse you, and we'll talk about the Carney honeymoon period that he's in a second. People excuse you blowing deadlines, but the quality of the product, should you blow those deadlines, have to be greater. So Mark Carney's operating on, let me get the best deal. Well, you've kept upping the ante, Prime Minister Carney, on what that best deal looks like by blowing these arbitrary, I would say, self-imposed timelines that you set out. Now you're increasing the bar on yourself, which doesn't seem all that politically smart. Now, he's still in a honeymoon period where I think, most Canadians are willing to forgive even the quality of the deal or what happens, but we'll wake up at some point in September. We'll see what's going on. We'll see the progress, and we'll see that a lot of hasn't necessarily happened. And frankly, a lot hasn't necessarily been iteratively communicated to us around what we should be looking for, when, how, what that ultimately should feel like. And so I think the Carney risk here is that many times honeymoons turn into nightmares. See no further than the 2014 movie Honeymoon, in which very quickly people can turn on you. And Mark Carney has done one thing this summer, which is reveal himself and add some clarity to the mix. And that clarity is that he is a conservative-leaning liberal. The cuts that he wants to make to the public service, the technocratic appeal, the spend on defense, none of those things necessarily hit Trudeau lane, which is obviously what they wanted to go from a political strategy perspective, but they're also true to who Mark Carney is and is revealing to be. And that reveals a lot of who he is and what opportunities the NDP and others may ultimately have with the Carney government. But honeymoons can turn sour very, very quickly, and they should not expect that these things have a long tail that ultimately diminishes. People can turn on you very quickly, and he's revealed quite a few cracks and quite a few directionalities around what he believes and how he believes it, and that's going to provide nothing but opportunity for the opposition parties.
So where I don't agree with everything that Zane says, it's surprising that most of it, I think he's spot on. And why that's surprising is because Zane works for a strategy firm that's out in Calgary, and they primarily work with the Alberta NDP. So you can tell basically where they're leaning. But he's got this right on. Even more than Mike Soderberg, I would say. And, he's not saying that Mark Carney's doing well. He's just saying, well, he's been in this honeymoon period, but these honeymoon periods can turn into nightmares very, very quickly. And that's the danger in the fall, because he was saying, well, we're going to get a deal in early July. Well, we're going to get a deal in mid-July. Oh, we're going to get a deal in August. And, maybe we're not going to get a deal in early August. We're going to get a deal at the end of August. Oh, well, I guess we're not going to get a deal after all. Hey, everybody, we already have the best deal, so there's no point in actually getting a deal. This is the issue. When you keep saying, well, we're going to get a deal by this, that affects your say-do ratio. And if your say-do ratio starts to get completely lopsided in that a lot of what you say doesn't line up with what you actually do, and in Mark Carney's case, there's very little on the do side, but there's a lot on the say side, people are going to start to get really ticked off, especially the people, as we've seen in the polls shifting, and in these anecdotes that we keep hearing from Conservative members of Parliament, where they have people coming into their constituency offices and saying, I voted for Carney. Okay? Well, I think it was a mistake because he's not getting a deal done with Donald Trump. Well, that's the decision you made, sir, and you'll have to wrestle with that at the ballot box. So this is what the effect is. And I think this is what these guys are basically saying. Like, come the fall, if Carney gets nothing done, and as we've said, we expect him not to get much done, this is why things will turn very, very quickly. And this is why we said, even after Carney won the election, that yes, the Liberals won. Yes, Mark Carney is going to be the leader, but he's not going to be given the runway that Justin Trudeau was. This isn't going to be a 10-year type of affair. This isn't going to be a 4-year type of affair in this minority government, because they don't have anyone to rely on to actually hold them up. So it's really going to be, when do the opposition parties see a chance to pounce? Because when you look at this, it's going to be a problem come the fall. Let's continue.
Laura, feel free to weigh in on the U.S. relationship, but I also want to pick up on what Zane said there about budget cuts, because that is also a major milestone that they're going to reach this fall, right? The first federal budget from the former central banker. This is his chance to put a stamp on the federal finances. He's all about the money, we know. What are you watching for there? I mean, there's potentially major cuts. A 15% across the board cut is a possibility to all government departments. That could be a political hot potato for this government too, right?
Yeah, and I think it's also really challenging for Prime Minister Carney, given he is an Ottawa area MP, right? And we saw, I mean, Pierre Poilievre, there was a lot of factors into losing Carleton, but that is a really big challenge for an Ottawa area MP, right? I live in the city, and let me tell you, there's a lot of people who are already getting those slips. There's a lot of jobs that are starting to be gone. So I'm absolutely watching for cuts, and I'm watching on the more micro scale the impact here in Ottawa. But on a bigger scale politically, this is really new. This is a really new posture for Liberals generally. This is going to be a very new thing for experienced ministers to talk about, and a very new thing for MPs to try to sell to constituents. And the promises in the platform were pretty significant. So what I'm curious to see is actually the interplay. We're getting a budget in the fall. It is likely we'll be getting a budget again in the spring. That's really short order. That's about 6 months. So I think what's going to be interesting is what happens in the fall and what sort of signals are we getting for the spring, because I think that there may be some balance trying to happen between needing to show immediate change, but also not wanting to shock all Canadians right off the hop.
Ottawa area MP. All we heard that was happening in Carleton is the Liberals were going around and saying, Poilievre's going to take your job. Well, turns out it's going to be Mark Carney that's going to take your job. And that Mark Carney has been the one taking your jobs. 15%. That is a massive chunk out of a budget, folks. And you can't handle that with just cutting projects and, cutting pieces here and there. The biggest piece of that, of any payroll, is staffing. That's what it comes down to. So the question is what are the folks in Nepean going to be thinking the next time they go to the ballot box and they're thinking about Mark Carney, when they were all told, hey, if you vote Conservative, they're going to take your jobs. Well, look what happened. Look what happened. Mark Carney doesn't seem like he's going to be waiting for a gradual approach as people retire, not renewing. Nope. No, he's not waiting for that. That may be in the plan, but when you tell the agencies, hey, listen, you need to find 15%, it's going to be unavoidable. Jobs are going to be cut. And as we saw earlier in the summer, one of the analysis is predicting up to 90,000 jobs could be gone from the federal government. So this is going to be a big problem for messaging for Liberals, because they're not used to doing this. They're not used to spinning that. And if they're not used to riding that bike, that's going to be a big problem in trying to do that and convince people. Well, they have a hard time convincing people of anything in the first place. But when you're talking about something as significant as this, they're going to be floundering.
Yeah, Michael, what are you watching for with this budget? We're expecting it fairly early on in the parliamentary session. What do you think is going to be coming down the pipe?
Yeah, well, the finance minister, I believe, was clear that they intend to table this thing come October. So we don't have a very long to wait here. But I really do think that the austerity measures that the prime minister dictated his cabinet to seek will be the big story. I think pragmatically, because of what the cuts ultimately mean to various government services, which have already been critiqued in terms of their malaise and kind of slow churn. Does gutting the amount of public sector workers contribute further to that? Maybe. Or does it create a lean, mean machine? I don't know, but I do think that will be the story. And I also think, frankly, it is that political landmine potentially for the prime minister. I always said that Justin Trudeau is the best New Democrat prime minister that we never had.
There we go again, talking about cutting the public service and it posing a lot of problems for Mark Carney. He's demonstrated he is not a politician. Why? Because he's made so many political mistakes. You can't even count them. And this is where the Conservatives are like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they're just writing them all down. And it's going to come to bear on him in the fall. He's going to have ethics investigations. He's going to have investigations in committee on his conflicts of interest. They're going to be digging all of that up. They're going to be diving into the fact that this EV mandate is a big problem and concern for Canadians. Poilievre and the Conservatives are going to be bringing up carbon tax 2.0, which Carney hasn't dropped that. And they're going to be pounding on the consumer or the industrial carbon tax and a whole bunch of other issues. Air Canada, tariffs, Trump. You name it. It's an endless list of this stuff. And then the budget is going to be absolutely astronomical. And government moves extremely slowly. So if he thinks that all of these agencies are going to have all this figured out by October, he's got another thing coming.
Zane, a quick final thought to you on that?
Let's just quickly talk about the 15% over, I believe it is 3 years, JP. You can correct me if I'm wrong. So it's not a 15 on this budget.
No.
That's a crazy number. Like, that's a really high number. To be clear, you can't do that simply just with salaries. There's going to be programmatic cuts, and there's going to have to be telegraphing of service cuts here. And that is, to Michael's point, where the extension of where the NDP, but frankly, who cares about the NDP? We'll talk about them in a second. Where the public will start to notice immediately. When you start telegraphing that certain services, people don't like having things taken away from them, even if they don't use them all that often, because it's using the American term, it's an entitlement. It's already something they have. And it's even if they were theoretically going to use it or access it, they want it in their orbit. And so to take it away, which is what this 15% cut, should it be reported correctly, is ultimately striving for, it will go down to service levels. It won't just be people in Ottawa that will feel the pain. It will be people all across the country that have a theoretical or a service that they use that will be cut. And that is when a potential honeymoon could end very, very abruptly, very, very quickly, because it's not about the technocratic skills you promised during a campaign. It's about how you feel the people in the moment in the fall of 2025 and beyond. And that's a very different skill set. It's same political game, very different skill set. Winning that campaign and reading the room in the fall with the budget are two completely different skills. Let's hope the Carney team has the folks around them to make those right calls.
I gotta say, this guy's really sharp. I'm actually impressed because he's zeroing in on some really, really good points. As we said, what's going to happen, right? What's going to happen if you have these agencies having to make all these cuts and then service levels drop, and then Canadians who voted for the Liberals aren't going to be happy about that when you have to renew your passport, when you have to, access the CRA, when you have to access any of these other agencies, when corporations are trying to access these other agencies and they're having problems because of delays and, all you hear is complaints of short staff and budget cuts and all of this stuff. It's going to be a nightmare. And that's just one issue. As we say, this fall is actually gearing up to be one of the most dynamic fall sessions in recent memory. And this is where Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives, they need to bring their absolute A game, because this has been served up on kind of a platter for them, and they need to play to win. Do not play not to lose. That's my advice to the Conservatives. Don't play not to lose. Play to win. Go after them. Go after them respectfully, but go after them. Unleash your team. Get Barrett out there. Get Cooper out there. Janice and Kuzi and and Brock and all the rest of them. Get them out there. And get Lanceman on mainstream media. Get Barrett on mainstream media. Get your best speakers and just pound them over and over again. Why? Not to talk to mainstream media, to talk to those swing voters that you cannot get in front of via social media. There's a lot of people that will not watch Northern Perspective and the other independent news channels just because it's on YouTube and they've been told, oh, don't worry about them. You know, they're just conspiracy theory nut jobs. Get the message to them. And you only can do that by going on mainstream media and do it frequently, often. Bang, 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 bang. Constantly remind them what's going on and what Mark Carney has been failing to promise you. And if you keep doing that, and if you keep holding him to account in the House, this fall, people were talking about the swing of the other way where the Liberals came back and gained on the Conservatives. If they keep doing this, you will see the fastest swing probably in political history in Canada swing the other way, which as we think and as we keep talking to people sets up the very real possibility of a 2026 summer election.
The next 3 months are going to make or break Mark Carney and the Liberals.